I can't take the pressure. I'm sorry. Good evening. I have a confession to make. When Ilkar invited me to appear tonight, I was in the middle of holiday preparations for the big Jewish holidays that just passed. We had our the day before Eid al-Adha. We had Yom Kippur, which is like, you wait up for these days. On one day you get 6 to 7 times more people than you get on a regular Saturday, and so you prepare for weeks and months and everything. And then it's sort of like now we're in the middle of probably the biggest biblically mandated holiday in the Jewish calendar. It's called Sukkot. Christians know it as Tabernacles, and I have no idea how it's known in Islam. Apparently not. So somewhere along the line, I did not get the message that tonight was about Abraham. So I've been scratching down a few notes. I have a few things to say, and we will certainly see if any of it measures up. If it's informative, I'm glad. But I thought it might be good to note that in my interfaith work, whenever I was on a panel before with Muslim representatives, we always were amazed at how much we had in common. Burial rights, marriage rights, like all kinds of the food, halal, kosher. There's a lot of similarities. And we always came away saying, we got to continue this dialogue. So I'm hoping that happens. And also, here's another similarity. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca to go see the Kaaba, Hajj needs pilgrimage, right? And the Hebrew word for a pilgrimage holiday is Chag, which is exactly a cognate from the Hebrew to the Arabic. So we have a lot in common. We have a lot in common with Christianity too, but enough's been said about that, I think. So who are these pesky Jews anyway? It's very difficult to actually give a definition as to who are the Jewish people, because the definitions change with one person to another and over the years. But I thought I'd try and get a few things sort of straightened out as best I could with the time allotted to me. First of all, I see Judaism as more of a tribe. What do I mean by that? If you're born into a tribe, you're a member of the tribe to the day you die, unless you do something to take yourself out of the tribe, like joining another tribe. You can join a tribe. Many of us have experience watching Westerns on television or in the movies, and people like Little Big Man, Dustin Hoffman. You can join a tribe. Richard Harris, A Man Named Horse. You can join a tribe. There are initiation rites. Some of them are painful, especially for guys. But nonetheless, one can join a tribe. And once you join a tribe, you're a member of the tribe to the day you die, unless you do something like taking yourself out of the tribe, like joining another tribe. And if you're a member of the tribe, the religion of the tribe is Judaism. In modern times, that's a spectrum of observance or beliefs, or this is the hard part to pin down. The people who call themselves Orthodox believe in one thing, and the people who call themselves Reform believe in something that started off as almost diametrically opposed and has come much more to a reconciliation. And I was trained in sort of the middle ground, the conservative movement. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily wishy-washy, but we try to conserve what we can of the tradition, at the same time being in modern times, try to meet the needs of the Jewish people at this time. Judaism, as I describe it, as being the religion of the tribe, Judaism is not a biblical religion. And I say this because there's a lot of people who think that Judaism is somehow encapsulated in the book of Leviticus, with all of its sacrifices and all of its ritual impurity. And it's true that at the beginning of the Judaism that developed into the Judaism today, these things were very, very important. But I have to tell you that Leviticus is maybe part of the tradition, but it's certainly not the only part, and it's not what happened. In the New Testament, a group called the Pharisees gets a bad rap. They're legalists, they're lawyers, they're hypocrites, et cetera, but you know, the winners write the history. The Pharisees are the spiritual ancestors of rabbinic Judaism. And what does it mean to be this? A Pharisee, someone, the prushim in Hebrew, means they explain stuff. And so they're developed an entire body of religious material that is not biblical. It's based in biblical roots, it's based on biblical scripture, it has biblical support, but nonetheless, the actual authority did not come straight, at any rate, from the Bible. And so I think it's important to understand that when you're talking to Jews today, we are not talking about what sacrifice did you make on what holiday. We are talking about a different set of ethical and religious considerations. All right. I also would say it's out of this body of literature, much of which is called the Midrash. In the same way that you have the Quran and all of its surahs, and then you also have the Hadith, all the sayings of the Prophet. Am I wrong? Let me know if I'm wrong. Okay? We have the written scripture, the written Torah, and we have the oral Torah, which is an interpretation. And why was it oral? Because it changes in every generation. In order to really understand what's going on, you have to be able to swing with what's going on in your day. And that if that's the case, then things will change. And I'll give you an example that's not religious, so it might be easier to get. There's not a lot of words that mean the same thing they meant 50 years ago. You can't use the word gay anymore to mean happy. Okay? Let's see, I'm trying to think of another good example. Oh yeah, there's only one word that meant really good and acceptable that's the same now as it was 50 years ago. And we went through a lot of them. You know, things that were hip, things that were, whatever they were. But the only one that really kept its meaning over the years is cool. Okay? Other than that, you know, there was a time when bad meant good. That's bad. That meant it's good. So, you know, so things changed, so the tradition had to be oral in order to support that. Eventually it got written down because we were in diaspora, and we were scared that it was going to get lost. Now, it only took a few hundred years to write it down, so you can see what pace we work at. Of course, it's not exactly like Nostra Aetate that took like 2,000 years to come across, but, you know. Nonetheless, we do sometimes take our time. And it's out of that oral tradition, that literature, that we have very similar stories that you have about Ibrahim. We have it in a different order. We have him that he made the choice that God was not in the stars, the moon, or the sun, and could only be an invisible, all-encompassing God. He comes by this decision first. Then he goes on, and the way that the Midrash tells the story in our tradition, which is remarkably similar, is that it's not just the idols in the temple that Abraham destroys. It's his father's idol shop. It's the family business. His father made the idols. His father leaves to go get a cup of coffee, which in the Middle East is what you do. And then Abraham gets it into his idea. He has already gone through a number of experiences where a soldier came up to him and wanted an idol he could carry into battle. And Abraham says to him, "How old are you?" "I'm 50. You're 50 years old and you think a little statue is going to help you? And the guy leaves and goes to another idol shop, you know. And there's a couple of stories like this. And finally, Abraham gets at the idea. His father goes out for a cup of coffee or whatever, you know. And Abraham takes the axe, completely destroys all the other idols, puts the axe in the hands of the largest idol, as Sohail had mentioned. And when his father comes back and says, "I leave the shop for 5 minutes," and what happens? He says, "That idol came to life and destroyed all the other idols." And his father says, "Don't be stupid. Idols can't do that. They're just made out of stone and metal and wood." And Abraham says, "You hear what you're saying?" And eventually, there are in the Midrash an interpretation of some of the things that are in the Bible, but it comes out that Abraham has 10 tests that God gives him before he can be considered the progenitor of the monotheistic people. Abraham, as Rabbi Stern mentioned, a lot of people call him the first Jew. Well, there were no Jews back then. The name Jew comes around the time when the people lived in Judea, so they were called, that's called Yehudah, and people were Yehudim, and that became the Jews. So we were Israelites, we were Hebrews, we were a number of other things. We weren't Jews until then. Nonetheless, Abraham, last test is the test where he's told to sacrifice his son. Now, in our tradition, he's told to sacrifice his son Isaac. Now, with what I understand of the Islamic tradition, through the Hadith, you learn that it's Ishmael that he was going to sacrifice. And the argument goes on whether or not he actually passed the test by being willing to sacrifice his son. The rabbis had when I say the rabbis, those were the people who were descended out of the Pharisees intellectually and wrote all the interpretative material. They had a lot of trouble with this. And think about it. If you were to talk to God today and God told you to kill your own child, would you do it? Anybody? Can I see a show of hands?
Which one?
Yeah, right. You bring up a very interesting point. I've only got two, and I know which one. It's funny. There actually is a rule in the Bible, that says that if you have a wayward and rebellious child, you can take that child to the edge of town and stone him to death and say, this was our wayward and rebellious child who disrespected his mother and father. There's a little formula you're supposed to say. And the rabbis got a hold of this and said, oh, no. We're not doing that. And they said they couldn't take it out because it's in the Bible. They can't just write out something that's in the Bible. So what they did is they over-legislated it, that how wayward and rebellious do you have to be? Well, it says to your mother and your father. So you have to be equally disrespectful to your mother and your father at the same time. And what they did is they legislated this out of existence and made the statement, no child was ever taken to the edge of town and stoned because they were wayward and rebellious. In other words, the rabbis had problems and they dealt with them within the system. So they get to the point about Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And they say, how could Abraham, the man who argued with God about whether he's going to destroy Sodom, how could he not say anything when God says, take your son, your only son, the son that you love, and take him up to the mountain where I will show you and sacrifice him upon a hill? They wrote in extra dialogue. They said, God says, take your son, and Abraham says, which son? I have two sons. The one you love, I love both my sons. He finally gets to the point where he says, Isaac, and Abraham's silent. But nonetheless, in the Midrash, Abraham offers up an argument, which is a tradition. It starts a long tradition with Jewish people. We argue about everything. There's a long-standing joke, like 2 Jews, 3 opinions. The numbers change because of inflation, but nonetheless, we have set the stage that it is okay to argue with God. It is okay to be angry with God. It is okay that when things are not going your way, that you can have a dialogue with and an argument with the Creator of the universe, and that's fine. One of the things that in my dialogue groups, previous dialogue groups, it came up that certain people within the Islamic fold consider the Hebrew Scripture, the Bible, an imperfect work. Now, I'm not trying to stir up a hornet's nest here, but I always thought that it meant that they had latched on to some of the inconsistencies and repetitions within the Bible, and they started to see that maybe perhaps that human hands were involved in its creation or something like that, but no. It came about in the discussion of the life of Joseph. Joseph, in our story, is a vain little twit who doesn't know when to stop. and telltales on his brothers, and he's a little, like you would kick this guy if you knew him. And it was brought out that in the Quranic version of the story, Joseph is a perfect person. Jews hate perfect people. No, it's just not our thing. We like the idea that there are imperfect people in the Bible. They serve as a model. And when we read these stories, we read these stories with the eye that we too are imperfect, and thereby we are capable of reaching the same spiritual heights, the same status as anybody else that you can mention in the Bible, Abraham, Moses, etc. You can do it because they were imperfect. Moses got angry. Abraham, was imperfect. Abraham was, can we be honest here? He was the progenitor of the entire, monotheistic faith, 3 world traditions. He was a lousy family man. Kicked out his wife and baby, almost killed his son. What would you call social services for today? Nonetheless, it's because he's imperfect and still had that faith that we can look to him and say that this is the person we are looking toward to set an example of setting our own relationship with God. Okay. See what else I scribbled down here. Oh, yeah. I was talking about the way the rabbis wrote the Midrash. There's a story about Abraham having circumcised himself. Now, that's dedication. And as he's recovering in the heat of the day, he's in pain like you couldn't believe. And he sees 3 strangers coming up, and he says, we have to welcome these people. And he tells his wife to, go slaughter a calf and make the food. And we are having a big celebration. We have strangers to celebrate. So the rabbi said, well, how could Abraham see it? He must have had a tent that was open on all 4 sides, so he could see anybody coming in any direction, and he would be able to welcome them. This is a beautiful thought, and obviously thought about by somebody who has never put up a tent. Because the putting up of the tent in actual physical terms was not the point. The point was, as the rabbis wrote their values large, was hospitality. And how do you encompass that in a global form? You have that you're open in all directions, and that's why they came up with this idea. A tent that was open on all 4 sides would fall down, but not Abraham's. I also want to point out Abraham, as was pointed out by Rabbi Stern, is sort of like one of the ultimate immigrants. He comes from a distant place. He's told to go somewhere. He doesn't even know where it is. And he finally winds up in the land of Canaan, in the land of what's now Israel. And what's the first thing he does? He picks up and leaves because there's a drought, and he goes to Egypt. He comes back, and he goes back and forth, and he has doings and dealings with all the people around him. And he establishes himself in the way that immigrants establish themselves. He's upright, he's honest, he does good business, he has interaction with people, and he starts to buy land. His wife has died, and he goes to the Hittite, what was his name? Uriah? No. Uriah the Hittite. And he says, I want to purchase the cave in the corner of your field, the cave of Machpelah. And the Hittite says, take it, use it, whatever, it's yours. And Abraham says, no, I am paying for this land. I do not want there to be any argument over this in subsequent generations. I do not want your children to say, my father gave you this, but I do not. I am buying this land. At which point, the Hittite says, okay, fine. What's 400 shekels between you and me? 400 shekels at the time is like, a fortune. And Abraham pays it without blinking, putting the lie to all those cheap Jew jokes, okay? And he does it so he can establish the first piece of Jewish real estate in the Holy Land. He does it with concrete, practical terms. And it's with those concrete, practical terms, I think I'm going to leave you here tonight understanding that our version and our vision of Abraham is that he serves as an example of how to lead a life even when you're not perfect, in concrete and real and practical terms. We live in this life, and Abraham was an example of how to do that. Thank you.